it would increase the flow of migrants, I think we can say. And yeah, that fact, or that interpretation at least, lends credence to my perspective that this was never really thought through, this policy of maximum pressure on Maduro.
What's going on with Venezuela? There's another ship chase taking place in the Atlantic Ocean. American naval vessels are pursuing an oil tanker off the coast of Venezuela. The US has already seized two vessels, saying they were trying to evade sanctions. Venezuela says it will retaliate. Some of the neighbors are now anxious. Well, Matthew Bryza is a former US ambassador and a White House official, and he's here to talk us through this. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Tito. Nice to be with you.
Well, great to have you on. What is this all about? You know, I've seen it going on for weeks now, but what is actually happening? Where is it leading, do you think?
I think what it has evolved into is an attempt by President Trump to overthrow Maduro, the leader of Venezuela. But for many weeks, people have been wondering the same question, and it hasn't been clear because initially what President Trump said the objectives of all this pressure on Venezuela is to cut the flow of drugs, specifically originally fentanyl, into the United States, and to cut the flow of migrants into the U.S. But no fentanyl really comes to the United States from Venezuela. I mean, that comes from Mexico with Chinese precursor chemicals. Venezuela produces or is the transit point for a lot of cocaine, which props up the Maduro regime, but that cocaine doesn't come to the United States generally either. So as the pressure has increased week after week, it seems clearer and clearer that President Trump's goal is to try to overthrow Maduro. And in fact, President Trump's chief of staff admitted as much in an article in the magazine Vanity Fair that was published last week.
We'll come back to whether that's a really bad idea or not. But can he do this with this kind of blockade?
Whether it will succeed, it really depends upon the psychology of Maduro. Blockades. A blockade in this case, it's a selective blockade, and President Trump has said it aims to curtail the export via sanctioned tankers of Venezuelan oil. If this blockade does cut off the flow of Venezuelan oil, yeah, that could be economically crippling for Venezuela. It actually would be economically crippling. I mean, already the Venezuelan economy has collapsed more or less in a way that's unheard of in peacetime in the 20th and 21st centuries. And if you cut off all the exports of oil, yeah, there's really no or very little revenue for the Venezuelan government. So that's enormous pressure on Maduro, who's already not popular. He lost the last election in 2024 by a landslide, but refused to leave power. So that could be sufficient pressure at least to catalyze some sort of an uprising against him, but who knows if that's what will happen? And he may respond with repression and or just be stubborn and stay in power.
And if that did happen, one of the consequences presumably would be, a mass sort of departure of, as happens with any broken state of migrants, many of whom would be trying to get into the US. So in terms of the original goals as spelled out by Donald Trump, it may not sort of have an effect on fentanyl, but it could increase the flow of migrants.
I very much agree with you, Gito. Yes, it would increase the flow of migrants, I think we can say. That fact, or that interpretation at least, lends credence to my perspective that this was never really thought through, this policy of maximum pressure on Maduro. If you go to the beginning of the Trump administration, there was an initiative by one of Trump's senior advisors, Ambassador Rick Grenell, to Venezuela, where he met with the leadership and came back with some Americans who had been imprisoned in Venezuela. And it looked like then the initial Trump approach is going to be one of trying to negotiate and in a let's say softer way. And then everything changed, and that it seems to have changed when Secretary of State and National Security Advisor Marco Rubio became stronger within the administration. And his family immigrated to the U.S. from Cuba. His parents did. And Cuba is a key ally of Maduro. And Cuba's current regime is able to stay in power largely on the basis of the oil it receives at a huge discount from Venezuela. So the whole objective changed, the whole rationale changed. But as you point out, because the whole process wasn't thought through and consistent in a logical way, now you've got this additional inconsistency of a broken Venezuelan state undermining one of the key U.S. stated objectives.
And that's why some of the neighbors are getting very anxious. I think Brazil have, been quite explicit, warning about a humanitarian catastrophe and mass emigration and all that. How anxious are they?
Yeah, they are anxious, and Colombia too. I mean, there's been a very large, there's several million or a couple of million Venezuelans who have moved into Colombia for the time being. And yeah, I think there is that sort of material concern about refugee flows on the part of the neighbors of Venezuela. And I also think there's a legacy concern about the U.S. history of interventions in Latin America. I mean, I was as you said, a former professional diplomat, and would like to think the best of our foreign policy. But it's true that the U.S. has intervened throughout the last 2 centuries repeatedly in Latin America and prompted regime change in several cases. And often those interventions, I think like this one, were more emotional than strategic. There's a sense in whoever the president's mind is that the U.S. needs to get rid of this quote unquote bad guy. Why? Well, you can come up with all sorts of justifications, but often it's an emotional response stemming from a sense that the Western Hemisphere is to be dominated by the United States, and there should be no hostile forces, whether they be external or internal, that threaten stability. And that is, in fact, the core element of President Trump's national security strategy.
Matthew Bryza, thank you very much for joining us and walking us through that today. It's been fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you.